is Jerri Ward back with another segment of I Object, Justice Examined. And I have a wonderful guest for you today who's going to be talking about a topic that is very timely. The name of my guest is G. Edward Griffin, and he is the author of The Creature from Jekyll Island, and I'm going to be talking a little bit more about his background in a bit, but we are going to be talking about the Federal Reserve. I'm also going to have a pre-recorded clip made by Professor Kevin R.C. Gutzman, who I've had on this show before. He's the author of The Politically Incorrect Guide to the Constitution, and it's very appropriate to have that clip on because next week on September 17th is Constitution Day, and we're going to be talking about the state of our constitutional government and the threats there, too, in that clip. Let me, first of all, mention something that I saw in the Wall Street Journal yesterday, and I think that everybody knows about the subprime mortgage meltdown and what's been happening in that market and all the efforts that the federal government has been making to try to supposedly save that market by injecting money into the system. But let me tell you a little story about some of the fallout, because some of the poor mortgage holders happen to hold mortgages with companies who have American Home Mortgage managing their mortgages. In other words, they're the ones who bring in the mortgage payments, pay out the taxes, and pay out the insurance. Well, it so happens that this company went bankrupt, and now homeowners' property taxes and insurance is not getting paid. And, of course, what that does is, first of all, not paying your property taxes means that the local government can come take your house. And also, if you miss premiums with your mortgage insurance, that sends your premiums skyrocketing. But I think that everybody who listens to this show considers themselves a conservative, and part of that, to me, is realizing what a disaster the federal government is because of all the power that has accumulated. And let me just give you an example of that in this American Home Mortgage situation. We're dealing with mortgages through Freddie Mac and Ginnie Mae. And before American Home Mortgage went into bankruptcy, they got busy and started screwing up, quite frankly. They suspended the company's loan servicing rights. And then some of the employees of Freddie Mac and Ginnie Mae went in there and physically sat in stairwells and doorways, preventing the loan servicing people that work for American Home Mortgage to come in and mortgage these people's loans. And now they've got it so messed up, they've taken over it. The feds have taken over it, and the paperwork's all messed up. They don't know what money's come in, who to pay, and how much to pay them. So you can imagine what a fiasco that is for the mortgage holders. And all of this is born from too much centralization, from the fact that we have a banking cartel handling things in this country. And that brings me to my guest, G. Edward Griffin. And let me tell you a little more about him. He's a writer and he's a documentary film producer with many successful films to his credit. He's listed in Who's America, and he's well known because of his talent for researching difficult topics and presenting them in clear terms that all can understand. He's dealt with subjects such as the Federal Reserve System, international banking, terrorism, internal subversion, the history of taxation, and other very important topics. He, as I said before, is the author of The Creature from Jekyll Island, as well as other books. He's also the founder of Freedom Force International. And Mr. Griffin, I want to thank you for being here with me today.
Well, thanks for inviting me, Jerry. It's a pleasure.
Well, first of all, before we get a little further, why don't you explain to the folks what Freedom Force International is and tell them where they can go find out more about you at your website?
Well, thank you. That's an unusual opening because Freedom Force International is an organization that's conceived as a solution to a lot of problems. And we don't normally start talking about the solution until we have, devoted some time to the problem itself. But let me skip ahead. The problem that Freedom Force International is attempting to solve is the unbridled growth of government everywhere in the world and the corresponding demise in personal freedom. And the members of Freedom Force know about that. They're upset about it. But more than that, they have a plan to do something about it. And the plan is somewhat unique. The plan is based on the concept that the that the nations of the world, and of course we're talking here primarily about the United States, including the United States, that all nations follow a pattern that the political and economic and social policies of a nation are somewhat determined by what the sociologists call power centers of society. Those are the groups to which all the citizens belong. The more powerful groups, such as political parties, church organizations, labor unions, the Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, all of the organizations to which people belong when they support, the leaders of these organizations pretty much determine what the nation does. And when the focus here is on the word leaders, because the membership tends to follow. We like to think that the leaders are elected by the members. We like to think, for example, that the candidates for office that we vote for are selected by the people, or that they're selected by the members of the political parties. But that's not reality. The truth is that there is a very tight leadership clique in most of the major organizations, the power centers of society, and it's that small group that determine who the majority are going to follow. And so we recognize that, and instead of moaning about it and complaining about it and saying, gee, it shouldn't be that way, we've decided some years ago to play the game, so to speak, and to go into the power centers of society and to place people into leadership positions as best we can who have a freedom orientation rather than the people who are there now, which have a anti-freedom orientation. So in a nutshell, that's basically what Freedom Force International is all about. And anybody that really wants to make a difference in the world can learn a lot more about it by coming to the website. And that's Freedom Force International, all one long word, freedomforceinternational.org. O-R-G stands for organization. And I think you'll be very impressed by what you find there.
Well, I don't think there's any better example of what you're talking about than looking at the history of our central bank, the Federal Reserve. Would you agree with that?
Yes, that's a perfect example, yes.
And in fact, that's what your book, The Creature from Jekyll Island, is. And I think that people need to know what the history of the Federal Reserve is and how it creates money. And I'd like you to discuss that. First of all, why don't you talk about what you see or what the history is regarding our switch from essentially commodity money to these dollars that are just pumped out and printed by the Federal Reserve?
Well, that's more or less an issue that is well beyond the category of opinion. That issue is a question of history. You can look throughout history and see that every time a nation has abandoned gold or silver or something of tangible value as the basis for its money, then that nation is on a slippery slope that always, without exception, leads to its economic destruction. Because what happens is if you have a money supply based on something of tangible value, that means that the money supply can be expanded only through the exertion of human effort to create whatever that thing is that backs the money. It takes human effort to dig out the gold and the silver or the platinum or whatever it is. You could have a money supply based on wooden chairs if you wished, but it takes human effort to create those wooden chairs. And as long as that relationship exists, the money supply is geared to the capacity of human beings in that society to create it. However, once the political leaders decide that that's too restrictive for their tastes, that they want more money and more money, then they break the money supply away from something of tangible value, and it becomes now created by political whim. They have committees and groups of wise men and politicians and bankers who decide how much money shall be created and who shall create it. And every time that step is taken, what happens is that the money supply breaks loose and starts to expand at ever-increasing rates until finally there's so much of it, it floods throughout the land. It becomes more and more worthless until finally it's totally worthless, and the system collapses upon itself. That's the path that we're taking here in the United States right now, very much to my dismay, and that path is made possible by the Federal Reserve System.
Well, and before we go directly into its history, one comment that I want to make and see what your take is on this is one thing that concerns me about us in present-day society is that we seem to think that we are exceptional as compared to our founding fathers and past generations, and we don't seek to learn the lessons that past generations have left to us, because this is not something that's new. And in fact, isn't one of the reasons that the founding fathers who wrote our Constitution, didn't they try to put in protections because they'd had this very experience of utilizing paper money that was not backed with anything and seeing the results of that on the economy?
Well, absolutely correct, Jerry. That when the Constitution was drafted, the men there at that convention, every one of them had personally lived through periods of great destruction of monetary value during the colonial days, and especially during the Revolutionary War, when all of the colonies and then the Union itself were creating money, just paper money, to fight the war. There was nothing behind it. They were all IOUs. Okay, folks, we'll pay you back after the war. Just paper money being created by the wagon loads they talked about. And so they saw what happened to people's savings. The average family during those colonial times was economically destroyed. And so when they drafted the Constitution, this experience was very fresh in their minds, and they wrote the Constitution that explicitly forbade any kind of monetary system based on credit, as they called, or paper money without backing. And the Constitution specifically says that the monetary system of the United States must be gold or silver coin. And that's what came out of it. Well, now, today, of course, the bankers and the politicians don't want that, because that would severely restrict how much money they could raise, how much money they could create, how much money they could spend. And so they got rid of that provision, or they actually didn't get rid of it. That's the interesting part. They just ignored it some years ago. And, of course, by this time, the average American who has not been educated in this, they certainly don't teach that in the government schools, because the government doesn't want the population to know about those things or have those views. And so the average American today doesn't even think a second thought about the fact that we're not following the Constitution. Average American today has never read the Constitution, and if he has read it, he wasn't quite sure what he read,
Lawyers in law school haven't read the Constitution because we read case law instead of the Constitution.
Who needs that, right? Mm-hmm. Well, anyway, that's the long answer to the short question. Every time a nation has abandoned a real solid monetary system, it's been destroyed. And that's the path we're on today.
Well, let's get into the history of the attempts to institute a central bank, because we've been there many times numerous times in our history. In fact, Andrew Jackson fought off an attempt to form a central bank. Of many of the politicians, he should have known the impacts of this kind of banking on average people, since he came from that. And then there were other attempts in the 1800s to institute central banks that were fought off. Isn't that correct?
That's absolutely correct, Jerry. It's an interesting fact, which I did not realize prior to my own research, was that the Federal Reserve System, which is technically called a central bank, it's not a bank at all. It's just it's a cartel, is what it is. It's a cartel of commercial banks which have been given a monopoly to create the nation's money supply. That's what it really is, and they call it a central bank. The Federal Reserve is a central bank, and to my surprise, it wasn't the first one. It was the fourth one in our history, and I never knew about that. And the first three were all gotten rid of very promptly by Congress because of their miserable impact upon the economy. And I knew nothing of that when I went through school. I had to dig it out myself. And Andrew Jackson, as you just said, was the last great warrior against the central banks, and he put his political career on the line to get rid of the last one, which he did. And then, of course, some years later, another generation goes by, and the new students didn't know about what happened in history, and now we got the Federal Reserve coming along in 1913, and everybody thought it was new. So that's the story.
Well, let's talk about how they worked it into the system, and I think the place to start is to ask you, who benefits? What segment of society benefits from central banking?
Well, to answer that question, we have to go back and reemphasize the statement I made a moment ago, which is that the Federal Reserve System is a cartel. Many people think it's a government agency. I thought it was when I started into this project. It is not a government agency. It's a cartel. No different than a sugar cartel or a oil cartel or a banana cartel. This happens to be a banking cartel. It's a group of commercial banks who have come together and formed an agreement among themselves to regulate their own businesses and their own practices in such a way as to maximize their profits and to minimize competition from newcomers. That's what cartels always do. And in order to give it force, they went into partnership with the federal government. They had their cartel agreement rewritten so that it looked like a piece of legislation, and they passed it through Congress, and they called that the Federal Reserve Act. So now the cartel agreement becomes law. Everybody must now follow the cartel agreement, and that's why it has the appearance of being a government agency, is because there is a congressional law to enforce the terms of the cartel agreement. But it really is not a government agency at all. It's a hybrid. It's a combination of banking interests, the cartel interests, and, of course, they bring the politicians into it, too, because there are certain advantages to the politicians. So now, what does a cartel do? Cartel does not promote the interests of anything except itself. The purpose and the function of the cartel throughout history, since the cartel called the Federal Reserve System, since it was formed in 1913, has always been to pretend and to state publicly that it was working for the benefit of the American people, trying to protect the economy, slow down inflation, provide jobs, and all that sort of thing, to protect the average person against runs on the bank and stabilize the currency, all of these positive things. But you've noticed if you take these claims at face value and you have to give it a report card, I think the Federal Reserve gets an F for failure in every one of its stated objectives. But if you realize that what it really is a cartel, and its objectives are the strengthening of the banking system and the profits of the banking system, it gets an A in every category. So basically that's what we're looking at. This is a cartel which has baffled the American people into thinking that it's a government agency and to thinking that it's working for the benefit of the American people when it is not.
Well, let's go back to its birth, and that gets into the very interesting name of your book, The Creature from Jekyll Island. Why don't you tell the story of the men who conspired to bring this into being?
Well, that's a very important thing to understand. Yes, The Creature from Jekyll Island is kind of a dramatic title to a very serious topic, and a lot of people think that it's like a mystery story, or a sequel to Jurassic Park,
or a horror story. It is a horror story.
It is a horror story, and it is a mystery story too. But anyway, the reason for the title is that Jekyll Island is a real island. It's off the coast of Georgia. And it was on that island back in 1910 that the Federal Reserve System was created. And it was created there not at the halls of Washington, D.C. It was created on a private island, which was a resort island. In those days, it was owned by a small group of billionaires from New York, people like J.P. Morgan and William Rockefeller and their business associates. That's where their families went for the cold winter months. And that's where the Federal Reserve System was created. And I might add, created under conditions of extreme secrecy.
Well, yes, and we're going to be getting into that in the next segment. We're going to finish the history. Then I want you to explain to the folks how the Federal Reserve creates money, because it's not just printing it. It's doing something I believe is called monetizing debt, which is essentially voodoo. So let's stay tuned, and if you want to call in, the number is 1-866-884-TALK. And stay tuned, and we'll be back with my guest, Mr. Edward Griffin. Thank you.